In this session, we discuss families in the context of the environmental crisis, environmental activism in couples work, and the conditions for profound work. Gonzalo Bacigalupe, Ed.D., MPH, is a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and an associate researcher at CREASUR, University of Concepcion in Chile. Gonzalo is a Family Process Institute board director, treasurer, and was president of AFTA. A former Fulbright senior research scholar at the Autonòmic University of Barcelona and Ikerbasque professor at the University of Deusto in Bilbao. Gonzalo is also a painter and has had solo and collective exhibitions in Boston, Chile, and South Korea. Gonzalo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. Yeah, so what's been capturing your attention in your work?
Wow. There's always, I assume, one as a therapist has an attention on everything, and I was thinking about this interview and I've been wondering about what are some of the words or some of the things that really capture my attention. And there's one that I think has captured my attention since I began training as a family therapist in the mid-1980s. And that's the idea of ecosystemic. And, not just think in terms of systems and the family system and all that, but to really think about contextually. And so coming full circle now, I've been interested from a scholarly perspective, but also as an activist around issues related to the environment. And so I'm very committed in many local projects, but also more in terms of what I'm thinking, what I'm tweeting, what I'm writing, what I'm reading. What I'm reading, I guess, would be probably the way to think about what is it I'm thinking. I'm reading about the environmental mess in which we are, and that is getting worse and worse every day, and worse than even those who thought that it was getting worse is getting. So I'm thinking a lot about that, and I'm thinking again also about Gary Bateson ideas. In some way, for those of us who began training at the time of the height of the family therapy world, circular ideas, curiosity, circular questions, and all those things, read Gregory Bateson, and somehow reading Gregory Bateson was a lot about being confused, what he meant, what he was actually saying in terms of second-order cybernetics and power and control. But in a way, I'm going back to now seeing his strange writing as becoming reality, as being part of our life every day. So I'm thinking a lot about that as sort of something that I've been thinking forever, but somehow sadly becoming reality. This idea that, this need for control is destroying us at all levels. So that's one piece, and we can go into more. I'm co-editing a handbook on the global psychology and our relationship with nature, and we are 4 editors, and each editor is located in different continents. It's very interesting, breaking that idea that everything has to be produced from the UK and the United States. At least when it's about English stuff.
Of course.
I'm also editing a special issue of the International Psych Journal, International Psychology Perspective, something like that, the APA journal. In fact, we got more articles than we're going to be able to publish there, so we're going to be probably doing another one, also related to thinking critically about environmental psych, which is quite narrow in general, but to sort of bring the ecosystemic ideas in there and some critical ideas, some decolonial ideas, etc., into thinking about the environment. Now, that's the piece, and that's something that I'm planning also to have more time as I begin my sabbatical next week, this fall sabbatical. I've been teaching this summer. Thank you. It will be probably it will be my last sabbatical, actually, I think, before I retire at some point in the next few years. But the other piece that I've been in terms of my work as a clinician, but also as a reader and as a writer and as a thinker, if you want to put it that way, is this whole idea of how the idea of being transnational shapes you. And so I've been writing some pieces here and there, but I'm writing a chapter again for a book that has authors from everywhere about what it means for a counselor to work with families that are not just immigrants, but I would qualify them as transnational, as being sort of like in different places, but maintaining relationships with people elsewhere. And how does it relate also to the environmental crisis? It has not been an easy thing to sort of like research, but I'm thinking about what do we do as counselors when working with families that are moving, that they're moving, they have to move. There are political crises everywhere, economic crises everywhere. So people are continuously moving, trying to cross borders, not only to the United States, everywhere. I mean, in the Latin American continent, it's like incredible what is happening. So what is the kind of tools we need as counselors to actually work with these families, with these couples, with these individuals who basically they might have moved to a country, but they maintain an emotional connection with the previous country, not in terms just of nostalgia, but because of technology, they actually maintain a very close relationship with another geography, with another territory.
Gone are the days of the calling card.
Huh?
Gone are the days of the calling cards with
right.
Minute.
I mean, when I went to the United States in 1988, I remember to begin my doctoral degree. I'm from Chile and studied psychology in Chile, and I studied family therapy in Chile, but I went to do a PhD. At that time, speaking on the phone was something that you did quickly. Still, it was not cheap, and it was sort of used not as something unusual, so to speak, to maintain connection. So I have written actually a lot about the impact of technology, of the adoption of technology, and I'm one of those who, not only me, but a lot of people think that Skype did shape a lot of the migration for like a decade, and then now Zoom and basically phones and WhatsApp has changed the way people are during the migration process. They're basically maintaining contact. This is not. This is revolutionary. It's just happened in the last 2 decades, basically 2 decades and something. The large impact of and one of the biggest impact is that you are basically, we've always been bicultural, those who have immigrated, but in a way you maintain that identity and you have to negotiate that all the time. Even flying is not as crazily difficult as it used to be. It used to be that until the 1980s, even 90s, to be transnational, you had to be very wealthy, an ambassador, being in the military, or being very wealthy to be able to move. That has become sort of more something that, and if you move because you were a refugee, you were basically, you were never going to go back. Like my grandmother, my grandparents, my paternal ones, immigrated from the Basque Country in Spain to Chile in the 1920s, 30s, running away from the civil war there that was beginning. My they never went back to Spain, because they never had the means. They had to raise 7 kids. I mean, they just didn't.
The challenge.
And the only way to connect was through writing, letter writing. I remember my grandmother sharing with me the stamps. They were all like Franco stamps because Franco. And then when she developed glaucoma, she became blind, and basically she couldn't read or write. The letters stopped, and she was they were basically completely disconnected from the country of origin. So what I'm trying to say here is that there's more secular. So that's something that I in my practice, which has always been very small. I have for years, I basically worked with, even before the pandemic, have done a lot of work with couples who are transnational or bicultural, one from one place, one from the other. Maybe they have kids everywhere. And so, how technology has enabled me to actually do couple therapy or family therapy with folks who are maybe some in my office and some connected to a video conferencing like the one we're using right now to talk.
Right.
So then a couple of other things that I also been thinking a lot about is about getting old and how do you work and how you think and how you help people making sense of getting old. I'm one of those firm believer that a lot of what we do or think about in terms of our work has to do with our own personal lives. And that's one of the privileges of being a counselor, that in some way you can be more attuned to your own process. If you have kids, you have little ones. So
I do.
You probably are more closer to be able to be helpful to people who have little ones, or maybe you can be more empathic, or maybe you want to read more and learn more about what it is to parent a little one, right? For me, it is about getting old, thinking about retirement in the future, thinking about my 2 adult children, then thinking about the children of my actual partner who are close to go to college too. So so I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to move towards your last stage in life, and so that's something that I'm having more conversations about how to get rid of some things that stop you from enjoying life on the one hand, and on the other, how are we going to leave a better world for others? Which again gets me back to the environment. Yeah, I mean those are some of the things I as you mentioned in my bio, almost, like 8 years ago, or actually, like 8 years ago, I always wanted to paint. I always have taken photos and done a lot with photos, but I always wanted to paint, and I always wanted to paint as a kid, but somehow, it was never encouraged. And so I had an accident, broke a bunch of bones in my shoulder.
Oof.
And I couldn't sleep. And I had bought months before that some, brushes and some paintings, some acrylics, some stuff. I have been talking to artists, but I had never took some little classes, but I never really ventured into actually painting.
Mm-hmm.
And having broken my shoulder and not being able to sleep and having to take a leave of absence from work, I began painting, and particularly at night, and with my left hand. I'm right-handed, but I began painting with my left hand, and it was like rediscovering something new that I didn't know I had. So began painting and painted and painted. And it was almost like a discovering a new self, you know. So I'm building a studio for myself because I need the space and I need a space to hang my stuff and to be private just for painting. So yeah, those
what
are
an
the
incredible. Yeah, it's a wide breadth and a lot of
yeah.
depth in everything you're saying, Gonzalo. But it does feel like there's a couple themes that seem recurring in
Mhm.
the things you're tending to, from the ecosystemic work that you're talking about. That's kind of, as I understood it,
Mhm.
looking beyond just a family system and into the environment that they're in, which seems to be a recurring theme. And you were talking about Gregory Bateson's ideas and maybe how like
Mhm.
some ways that you're reading them in 2024 as you're connected with
Mhm.
the environment and some of the systemic ideas that you were kind of
Yep.
trained in
Yep.
originally. And then as you're talking about the global psychology and environment program and starting to talk about transnationalism and perhaps how migration occurs in response to environmental
Mhm. Mhm.
tragedies and crises. And I really appreciate what you're saying there about the challenges a transnational experience puts. I'll speak to the United States at least. They're built for a kind of a homogenous American white English speaking middle class set of services. So in my work, where there's a lot of restraining orders, they're very challenged when you're working with an Afghan couple who's or cousins and their mom and dad, their respective parents all live in Kabul. And technically that's a violation of the restraining order to be in communication across the family members and stuff, but that's literally how the family functions. And also it's international. So the restraining order is just not set up to address this level
Right.
of
Right.
complexity in
Right. Right.
politics. But it feels like this piece of
Right.
the impact of the environment on families. And I think we also connected, correct me if I'm wrong, briefly at the AFTA conference in 2024 here in
Right.
Denver at
Right.
a couple of the environmental uh,
Right. Right.
talks.
Right.
So I guess that's
Right.
kind of where my attention is going. If it's okay to like kind of push you a little bit and you can, set
Yeah.
yourself free from my influence here. But what's give me like a background to like what brought the environment? It's a kind of an obvious feeling question, but
Mhm.
maybe not. Like what had you start thinking so
Yeah.
considerably about the environment?
Yeah. Well, it is something that I have always have had a lot of connection in terms of environmental activism more
Yeah.
generally. But about 10 years ago, I joined, well, let me clarify. In 2010, um, I had I was doing a lot of stuff related to health and technology and also the transnational piece. But I volunteered to help sort of like a network of people that were doing trying to support uh, volunteers in Haiti after the
Uh-huh.
big earthquake.
I
And
remember that. Yeah.
and at that time was I would say the height of the uh, optimism about social networks as a way of helping doing humanitarian work.
Yeah.
You
Early
know, it
days
was the
Facebook.
beginning of the sort of like the mapping, the community networking, the
Yeah.
all these platforms that help people to connect across the world. It was the time when everybody was thinking, technology will save us.
Yeah.
We know. I mean, I was one of those who said, "Be careful, technology." And I had a talk somewhere in a MedX kind of thing in a Stanford MedX conference where I had to all these people. Technology usually helps the ones who need the least help, and
Mm.
so you will basically have inequality staying more or less the same, but actually maybe intensifying as you have more tools to help the
Which it
more
seems like you
privileged.
were right about that.
And yes, and also I didn't know that it was going to be also a tool that will help the ultra right to emerge everywhere,
Yes.
to help them connect,
Right.
to develop their ideology, which is another theme that I'm very interested because I'm very active in social media in general.
And
So, but
connecting for fringe ideas.
But okay, so in 2010, the Haiti earthquake happened, and also the big tsunami and earthquake happened in Chile in the same
Right.
week, so to speak, almost. And then I later on I began working at a disaster research center in Chile. I came to Chile at that 2015 to do work related to the use of social networks and doing community work related to preventing disasters. The reduction of risk, so risk reduction. And that got me involved immediately with the environmental community, activist community in Chile, in particular, the one that is in the coast, as well as the one that is in the mountains next to the cities. And how do you do conservation on the one hand? How do you fight the urban spread? How do you deal with, all kinds of things related to the climate emergency? So got involved in several projects. I became a drone pilot, which is also related to this network thing about how to help people to see the territory from the top. And so we work with a lot of communities, helping them to rethink their territory and how they could defend it. So that was, it was sort of like applying some basic participatory action research stuff, using consultancy skills, doing a lot of work with the community. And that got me really, really worried about the environmental crisis in general and what to do about it and how to get people organized, because it's a political thing. It's not, the environmental crisis is not a technological issue. Again, it's this idea of resolving how do you degrowth is probably the only solution, basically. How do you think about, not about how you replace fossil fuels with batteries for cars, because that doesn't resolve the problem. The problem is individual cars. It's things of that sort. How to start thinking about that.
Yeah.
That's how and that's something also that I'm asking more and more. And that's something that we had dialogues about that in NAFTA. And I'm asking more and more to families and couples. I work mostly with couples about how is it that some of the capitalist ideology is the source of a lot of their problems. I mean, do you need another car? Do you need to move to a bigger house? Or why don't you move to a smaller place? Or why do you have to live? Why do you have to have your closet full of stuff? Or blah, blah, blah. So those conversations, I bring them explicitly in a way. And people say, well, isn't that political? I say, yes, in the same way that it's political to bring race or to bring gender inequality, or to how can you talk about couple relationships? You do not talk about patriarchy, and the question is, how do you do that? Have that conversation.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, but if I heard you right, there's something about, so you started your activism in 2010 in response to the Haiti earthquake, the nuclear earthquake in Chile. Sounded like as you were doing this work, there was some initial optimism about technology, though you had some hesitations. And that you started to become more concerned about the environment as you were doing this environmental activism.
And
what you described about the ways that social media ultimately emerged within, neoliberalism and a highly capitalistic society. So it kind of aggravated those existing cultural, philosophical ideas. And this is something I'm really captivated by. And part of that activism, correct me if I'm wrong, is how you're then positioned with couples to bring some really explicit and pointed questions about people in relation, in their intimate partnership, how neoliberalism and capitalism formulates and creates and contributes to problems. Is that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is really fascinating.
And an interesting thing, one of the things that when counseling people, psychologists or family therapists think about psychiatrists, they think about disasters, which are all human related. There are threats, they're natural threats, but all disasters happen because of where we are, how vulnerable we are,
I see.
inequality, blah, blah. But, when I work with, one of the things also, the other piece that got me into this is people will bring up issues that, that in some way, they're clearly connected to the larger, in this case, let's call it environmental issues. I mean, it is. I don't think I have the answer. I don't know who has it about what do we do with the capitalist system. I really don't know. And clearly, the develop for me is more. It's not that it's capitalism, because whatever happens in the countries that are more state oriented, they have the same problem. The problem is, how do we think about development? How do we think about how we should go and live our lives? And growth is the big problem. And in fact, that is also something that happens in what we study at the more intimate level. Is everything has to grow.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the conversations with Monica McGoldrick and others in the New Jersey Multicultural Family Therapy Institute about this notion of, Bowen talked a lot about the idea of independence, and rather and seeing independence as good, autonomy as good, rather than dependence, and dependence is bad. That kind of psychological thing that we go into dependence, when the fact what we need is interdependence, right? So how do we develop interdependency, and how do we care for the other might be more central than becoming more autonomous. And because becoming more autonomous is actually fantasy. In fact, as we get older, we need more and more the other. We become more dependent. Does it mean then that there's something wrong with that? Well, no. I mean, we get old. And we will have to be more dependent on others, right?
Army is kind of a fantasy, huh?
So, of course, it is a fantasy, because we are born human beings. The teenager at the house where I live now, my partner's daughter was talking about the other day about this notion of how is it that we need to mature. And I said, yes, we need to mature. We were talking about, but there's a point in which you join again, okay, but the human beings mature at a very slow way compared to all the other animals, which mature very quickly. But, maturity in itself always a good thing. There's a point in which, there's no more of that. I mean, basically, it's not, it doesn't happen being isolated from others, not with others. Right. What matters in the way is the relationships. And, it's something that I guess for AFTA members, is sort of like obvious. I mean, is the way we should be thinking about stuff, right? But that's not so obvious in the larger world. Maybe that's, that revolutionary idea was too revolutionary for the world that we are living in, which tends to think of individual success, even individual family success, the people I know success as the thing. And what we're realizing now is that if others are not being successful, they're not being, or not successful, whatever you define that, in another continent, we are destroying ourselves. It's just, that's the dynamics of the whole thing. Right. So, but let me get back to something that I've been thinking, that I wrote down as a little note here. I teach a trauma course. Every summer, I teach 1 or 2 sections of a trauma course. And, one of the things that, and I use a lot, I use the Judy Herman's work, Bessem van der Kolk works, and I use some of the work on resilience from some of our family therapy colleagues, and I do. But one of the things that I've been bringing more and more is racial trauma, Ken Hardy's ideas, right? And he has a phenomenal book. It's called Racial Trauma. I don't know if you read it, but and one of the things that students, when they read this book, because in general, when we think about, for instance, people start thinking about there's climate anxiety or the trauma of thinking that the world is going to
Yeah,
collapse.
I'm familiar with that.
There are people in the world, and that includes blacks and brown people in the United States, for instance, but everywhere.
Yeah.
They have lived under that trauma forever. I mean, the
Right.
the thing that more and more people are sort of like experiencing now, this sense that the world is sort of like collapsing, it's been the experience for those who are in really oppressed
Right.
situations like slavery, right? Forever. That's their life's been like that.
I'm even thinking about how black communities get zoned, right? How cities will zone industrial areas next to black communities.
Right. So that a bunch of little whites discover that, oh, there's a climate crisis. Oh, and Europe is all up to that. Where we got to be aware there's a lot that we need to learn from those who've been in the sort of like in the oppressed side, in the underprivileged side.
Right.
And I just, my students have, the book by Ken, which I really admire. I mean, he really is an amazing thinker. Brings forth this: how do we develop a model that acknowledges this, the tragedy of racism, right? Which is at the core of the U.S. identity, even though people might not want to. And then first we need to acknowledge it, and just let's acknowledge it. But then how do we build, how do we build a way of interacting with others? So not only that, so that we support those who are hopeless or who feel that their self is completely banished in this racialized society, but how do we then also all work together to change the conditions that lead to that? And so, I teach more and more. I teach trauma, not only in terms of picking up the pieces, but to figure out how we're going to develop just contexts. I mean, we cannot help if, for instance, and this is something that Hinda Winiger talks a lot about in her talks always, is there's so many people in jail in the United States, for instance. And I will add, there's so much threats every day with people being killed by someone shooting someone.
Yeah.
So how do we change those conditions that lead to a lot of anxiety, a lot of trauma? In a way, one of the things that I have learned, and I hope I have contributed a little bit in the AFTA community, is to figure out how we've been struggling with these issues for a while, in a good way or in a bad way, but we've been willing to enter into the conversations, and that's so valuable,
I agree.
One of the when you asked me initially, what I've been thinking, if you asked me 20 years ago, we would talk about the different models, we would talk about how we approach it, whatever. And I've been trying, I think that as we practice and as we, realize what might be more essential, I find, and this is something that sometimes my students, I don't know if they get bored listening to me, I say, you cannot do profound work. And when I say profound, doesn't mean that it has to be long-term. When I say, you cannot do profound work without establishing safety, so that the person who you're seeing doesn't feel safe, is safe emotionally, socially, cognitively, if she cannot sleep well, if, some very basic stuff, if she cannot exercise. So the people that we see and that's true for us, if we are not in a safe environment, I don't think we can do profound narrative work, for instance.
Yeah.
I associate a lot with some of the narrative ideas, but I do think that if we don't have certain basic conditions for the person to feel like they're not being threatened, they're not being violated, there's food on the table, there's someplace where they sleep, but also a sense that there's no threats around them, it's very hard to do profound work, which I hope is the one we do in counseling.
Yeah, I'm noticing too the challenges in that with, well, there's a couple contexts you're making me think of the ways you're describing safety from threat, perhaps not just in a therapeutic context, right? Like within the therapeutic relationship and the kind of alliance you form with the client, but from housing crisis, from food and water scarcity. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're extending this into threats from the environment that are coming in.
Absolutely. If you don't have access to nature, if you don't have access to a tree, or a body of water, or access to contact with nature, I mean, if your urban environment is aggressive, that makes it very hard for you first to be aware that you need to think about, that you need to impact the environment. But also, I do think that it does damage your soul.
Yes. And if I know anything about your work and ideas, Gonzalo, so correct me if I'm wrong, you're not talking about this contemporary 2024 urban version of the green space where they throw in like a patch of grass and a tree into the middle of an aggressive urban environment.
No.
What you're describing is different.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about how can we all have ways of I don't know, making our veggies into mulch and being able to touch even if we live in a small space, how do we can connect with nature on the one hand? And you need spaces. I hope there's trees. I hope that mayors worry about trees. But I do think that it's not so that you can have a selfie for Instagram, but that it is about figuring out how do we, okay, so let me see if I can explain this. One of the things that in dialogues with people who work in the interface between nature and the urban environment, in general, we don't do very well. And it used to be that we would live in towns or cities or places that were surrounded by nature.
Mm-hmm.
And what has happened in the last decade is basically we surround nature. It's sort of like we have designed, most people live in big cities or live in suburban in the United States, but not only in the United States, in other places too. They live in suburban areas, supposedly more connected to nature, but then they build a next suburb next to it. So it becomes, in the end, and also you end using a lot of cars, big roads, whatever, you end disconnected from a more calm way of being in the world.
It becomes a luxury to access that.
Right. And here, there's another thing. I mean, this sounds corny, but I used to live when I was a kid. It wasn't my parents were, my mother was a teacher, my dad was a chemist, but we didn't live in a very posh neighborhood or anything like that. But my house had in the back several fruit trees, and they have grapes. So we will eat grapes. When there were grapes, we will eat peaches when there were peaches,
Yeah.
apples when there were apples, or oranges, same
Love
thing,
it. Love it.
right? It's not so hard to figure out how do we can have, it's harder because there's more density in cities, but collective gardens, the experience of collective gardens
Yeah.
in, places like Chicago or Boston or many places actually, have brought in this connection. Not always. I mean, so right before the pandemic, I was very interested in figuring out how to develop collective gardens and collective places for growing food in neighborhoods, right? And so there's an experience in Chicago where there's a lot of empty lots in neighborhoods that are pretty vulnerable, and they discover, well, let's figure out how do we can grow our own veggies there. And then they figured out, well, it was too expensive to grow the veggies in small lots, but they figured that they could grow flowers, and they will say they will basically sell flowers that were not didn't have any chemical stuff,
Yeah.
that it was sustainable. And then the flowers brought in bees, which then they had honey. So in a way, then they had some income to buy good food, because generally in more vulnerable environments, basically what you have is liquor stores and no
Right.
real
Grocery
stores with real
stores and
food.
yeah.
And food is expensive. And particularly good food is expensive. Eating well is very expensive. So what I'm trying to suggest is, how do we develop sustainable spaces for people to be happy? I don't think that there's anything more interesting than growing something, that a kid can see something growing, or
Yeah.
that you can actually prepare your own bread if you have, some.
I completely agree.
Now, that's difficult if you have two jobs. If you're a sole parent and you have to raise a kid and you have to work like crazy and whatever, that's going to be, so you need a community to do so. I mean, let me put it this way. This is not going to be something that can be done by each individual, but I think that communities can do. And again, going back to
It's not an autonomous
my
task.
work with couples, I say, okay, so who supports you in what areas you do well? And
Yes.
when you start having the conversation, you realize that often there are areas in which, in the relationship, where there's the participation of others, where others are an important piece in their positive relationship.
The system beyond the couple.
Yes, the system beyond the couple. Exactly. Yeah. That is not all about the micro interaction, which we tend to pay a lot of attention.
Right.
It's important. You can do a lot of good psychoeducation about that. Right. Listening, not reacting, paying attention to what is evoking. There's a lot of things you can do.
Uh-huh.
But when you have a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old gets sick, and then one of the members loses a job, you need others to be able to support you.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But what the ideology is, the nuclear family is the ideal, and they should be able to resolve stuff. It's not, I was going to use a BS kind of word, but I think it's a lot of BS. It's very hard for people to do that on their own.
So difficult.
Unless you're very wealthy, of course, and then you can hire people, but that's having a community, right?
Yeah. And even then, there's just a couple things that you're making me think about, is how in I'm Iranian, my family, identifies as Persian.
Mm-hmm.
I have a 6-month-old now, and me and my wife had to go back to work. We're having this conversation here. What is it? August of 2024. And my mom has stepped in prominently. She is coming and staying with the 6-month-old, and my wife and I were really talking about having to get a nanny or something, and how, if we could even afford it. but
Yep.
there's something that's immeasurable knowing that's my mom with my son
Mm-hmm.
versus
Mm-hmm.
someone I'm hoping that I can vet
Right.
and assess
Right.
and be with
Right.
them, if that
Right.
makes sense. So that kind of
Right.
support has effects that are beyond monetary, you know? And so I'm thinking about even if I could take this metaphor and apply it to an environmental piece that like it's hard to really quantify or even qualify the effects of having vegetables from your garden, a fruit tree nearby, a community sustained garden, spaces that you can go that's green and also not like just grass. It reflects the natural environment that it should be in.
Right. But even when you're talking about your mom, you know, in a way that should not be free labor.
Yeah.
See, here's where that should be supported. Someone who does the caring job doesn't get an income from
Hmm.
doing
Hmm.
so.
Hmm.
And that should not be the case, and I do think that progressive countries that really have more progressive, supportive strategies, policies like Denmark or Sweden, or that where there's more of a thinking as that caring as being something that um, is going to be it's going to reduce the risk of having
Yeah.
a kid who gets sick, who
Yeah.
doesn't develop well, for having people that are stressed out, who are going to be, from being unproductive and all those things. I mean, there's not only sort of like it's not only good mental health, it's just basic preventive, good life kinds of policies that I do think that we don't necessarily have. Um, and of course, I mean, when I wrote a long time ago an article that it was it was published in the journals Feminist Family Therapy, and the I was uh, at that time, with like you with two little ones, and I was going through the whole tenure stuff, and I was thinking to myself, can you balance family and work?
Yeah.
I was asking myself all the time. So
I'm listening
finally,
to you keenly
I
here.
wrote an article that it was called "Is the balancing work and family and work, a sustainable metaphor?" Because all the time you see these articles about balancing, giving you advice about balancing, and and I did use myself. So I started the article. I don't remember much what I wrote, but I do remember writing verbs of things that we as a couple needed to do, as
Mm,
parents, as couple, whatever. This, do this, that. Whatever. It's like, can you balance all that? And I basically came to the conclusion you can't. So let's move away from this notion that you can balance it and just recognize that unless you have the right support, and for immigrants that's even harder because you don't have necessarily your network around
right.
um, to help you. You cannot just drop your kids to or your parents to take a night out or something, and that then it becomes expensive because you have to hire people, etc.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is some of these things that's individualized what should be community and social um, challenges is something that I always bring up to couples. I say,
Yeah.
okay, so you know, I could ask the hypothetical question: if there was this other support, how do you think that would support help you? So that maybe they're going to say, we don't have that support. Okay, so you have both a challenge that is not an interactional challenge. It's a challenge of you with, the world is basically
Yeah.
handing you in a lot of tasks that,
Yeah.
that should be more support for.
That's a beautiful way to frame it. And I imagine that it brings a little bit of peace to client couples who are in high conflict, turning towards each other, describing them as communication issues, and coming to understand that they're kind of facing some stuff here together. That makes a lot of sense to me, Gonzalo. I also want to say that I
Right.
hear you giving me an ethical charge here that I probably should set up a contract with my mom and get her a salary in for her because that's a pretty good consideration because they did a lot of privilege. Um,
Well, you need to think about how you can, you can figure out. I mean, this is where then that one is the conversation with her, but also it's how can you bring that up to another level, at the political
yeah,
level, at the policy level,
yeah,
how people can start realizing, okay, so caring has a value.
right.
I mean,
Yeah,
if she didn't care for the kids, you wouldn't be able to work, and there wouldn't be an income. There wouldn't be,
right.
it's
The
it's a
incredible
we are
effects that that
connected in that
has. Yeah.
sense.
So
Right,
Gonzalo, you've brought
right.
in like such a beautiful kind of both a broadening and a sharpening of focus around environmental concerns, the
Hmm.
broader community beyond just the
Hmm.
immediate couple system.
Hmm.
It sounds like you've done quite a bit of writing on this. So I guess as we're wrapping up here, you're talking about how you're teaching some trauma classes, and it sounds like you're engaging with students
Hmm.
nowadays. What is, as you're looking at folks coming into the family therapy world in 2024, where the shape of family therapy looks a bit different. It's been barraged by, at least in the
Hmm.
US, 30 or 40 years of heavy-handed neoliberalism and environments which most people, I think, I want to be careful about the word rational and stuff, but I think most people who are like oh, looking around would say that the environment is not so healthy and it's being affected by man's
Hmm.
uh, creations. What what would you maybe offer to the family therapists starting out here in 2024? And I'll center to you.
Well, first, yeah, I mean, one of the things that um, one of the things that sometimes, but that's something that maybe I don't want to say, oh, this generation, this or that. I mean, because I think that that's a stereotype, but I do think that when you are learning some of this stuff, um, one gets nervous because you see some principles, some concepts, some ideas, but you don't necessarily see a recipe
Yeah,
and or sort of like a very clear model. Um, I mean, even the idea of a model is complex, but then that's why maybe stuff like CBT is so popular for some, for in a way, when my students in my trauma class they do a unit that they can do online with these folks who have done evidence-based um, cognitive behavioral narrative therapy kind of stuff, sort of like a units that are very evidence-based. And students love that because it provides them with certain structure. It was sort of similar
yeah,
when I was learning family therapy, that I could learn some basic structural strategic
yeah,
ideas and apply them and see, whoa, there's some changes, right?
yeah, yeah,
um I know you will see some magic happening. And I do think that there's some value in structure in the work that one does with folks at any level.
yeah,
But I do think that we still need to do the hard work of really, really listening without having and be willing to contain the anxiety that provokes, to be with people, um, and to be more silent, to listen,
hmm hmm
and talk less. So, and then having permission to be very explicit about things that you're bringing in, from racism to the environment, the money issues, which I think are more complex for couples than sex, for instance.
hmm
I
hmm
think sex is easy to talk about. Money is much more complicated. Um, and not only knowing what the other one makes or stuff like that, but also, to really have conversations about money, about
yeah, yeah,
uh, what people value, what they want to do, how they see themselves in the future, or whatever. How do they, I think that for some couples who are okay with being always owing money, having loans, whatever, from others who feel like they need the savings and they need to, that kind of perspectives. So, where is family therapy? I do think one of the things that I'm still not clear, but that means that I'm sort of thinking out some hints, is this notion of we always tend to think of the environment as sort of like surrounding us in this Pearsonian, the circles, and we are the small one piece, and then
Yes.
But I tend to think more in terms of Barnett Pierce and Vernon Cronin's ideas of the coordinated management, where it says that basically the different contexts interact in different directions. It's not the onion, so to speak.
Right.
And so I'm very interested in asking more questions about how do we impact what we surround us, and not only how our environment determines us, which in a way can be very depressing because you feel like you cannot impact what's happening around you much. But on the other hand, it brings up the issue of agency. Yeah. Now, to change things, you need to be able to associate with others and to sort of find ways of changing the world with others. You cannot do that alone.
Yeah.
And so I'm, I don't feel like I can write as much as I used to, probably because I do think that so many people are writing so many things, but I do more and more think that our fields, when I say field, psychology, and generally the things that have to do with relationships and the psyche, we go back always to the psyche as inside the brain, so to speak, or maybe inside the body, but we tend to not think too much about what goes on in between us.
Yes. Yeah.
There were some hopeful people that during the pandemic thought, well, now we have more consciousnness about this. Now that there's less people in the streets, we realize that they're animals, and we're paying attention. And I was asked, because it was very active in media during that time, and I said, I don't think that the world is not gonna change after the pandemic. Probably things are gonna get worse. That's what happens with pandemics in the past, and history is a good. Had a big war after the pandemic more than a century ago, and then the other pandemics have not meant that the best of people shows up. Right. Things get quite rough, and so again, it's how do we impact what goes on around us?
Yeah.
So, for instance, I do think that our addiction to cars, not only in the United States, but many places, is a disaster. That the dependency on cars and not on mobility that is more public or using things that are more gentle to the environment and to our bodies, like walking, like bicycling, doesn't mean that you can do everything like that, but in a way, we could actually move towards a more collective way of moving around.
Yeah.
And we don't. We still rely on planes and cars.
Yeah. Well, I love this charge you're putting to family therapists and kind of bringing us back to some history here. How do we think about how do we impact what surrounds us? It's a beautiful question.
Yeah.
Gonzalo, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me here today and sharing your ideas with the team, the AFTA community, and the listeners here.
One of the things I will say is that for the AFTA community, none of these ideas should be so, how can I say, novel.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of resonance in what you're saying, and I imagine some things that you're saying might feel familiar and obvious to you, but are likely novel for a lot. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the interview.
It was a pleasure.